Yeah, welcome to today's session, where we'll be focusing on mastering your research methodology, a roadmap to success. So we would be looking at the different methodological components that you would most likely find either in your research thesis that you're doing or find in a research that you would like to publish. So my role here would be for us to look at these different components together and also, discuss within ourselves if these approach are within our research processes. So we would begin with methodology tips. So the first tip I wrote here is you start with alignment, which is very important. And I know for most of us that have a car, you would appreciate with that word alignment. Oftentimes, when you have issues with your tire or issues with aspect of your car that relates to the tire, and probably they did some changing of the tire and some of the components around the tire. The mechanic will always advise you to let's please take the car for alignment, so that they can ensure that the four tires are aligned. And when you're driving, your car won't be wobbling, So it also applies to research because the same way you have different components of your tire being fixed in 4 points, and you have to ensure that they're all working, together seamlessly. That's the same way research methodology is. Because in research methodology, many things happen. A lot of things happen. You have your research questions one side, you have your objective one side, you have your methods one side, you have the variables that you will be collecting to help you address the specific objectives you had stated, then your analysis plan, which you will now do after you have collected your data. So there are a lot of things happening at the same time, and you have to be able to align these things, and the methodology helps you do this because the methodology gives you a clue, on the different things that you would be doing, how you are going to be telling us where you're collecting that data, who you're collecting the data from, the number you're going to be collecting, how you're going to collect that number, you know. So all these different components have to be aligned because at the end of the day, you want to be able to address your research aim, your specific objective, which is what guides your research. So as a researcher, that is what you told us that you are going to be doing, you see. So that's why I always encourage my students during presentation that I know oftentimes people would say, 10 minutes is too short to make a presentation. Well, I don't think 10 minutes is too short to make a research presentation or a thesis presentation if you know exactly what to do. And this is what I discovered as a student and also as a tutor as well. When you say you are going to do a research, the research aim guides that purpose, and the specific objectives also guides that aim, meaning this is the overall thing I'm going to be doing. And to help me achieve that overall thing, I'm going to do number one, I'm going to do number two, I'm going to do number three, I'm going to do number four, I'm going to do number five. So when you're asked to come and make a presentation, what the panel really wants, apart from the guideline most schools have that they will give you, but the primary reason of making your presentation is to come and tell us what you said you would do, and if you actually did it. So your presentation will be more focused on your aim and specific objective. You said you're going to do number 1 in your specific objective. Did you do it? Show us the result that help you address that specific objective 1. Show us the result that helps you address specific objective 2. Show us the result that helps you address specific objective 3. So at the end of the day, if you're able to show satisfactorily, these are the things I said I was going to do, and this is how I was able to address them, you most likely, satisfy the panel. But you see, oftentimes people will spend more time talking about things they didn't do. You spend more time on your background. Your background has nothing to do with you. You didn't do you didn't do any, in short, you didn't do anything in your background. You were only talking about what other people did. Okay? You didn't do anything on your literature review. Okay? You are only talking about what other people have done. You see? So the only aspect where you would say you are original is in your methodology, where you started talking about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Then your results and your discussion, which is part of what you did, which is this is what I did, and this is how it differs, or this is how it's similar with what other people have done. So at the end of the day, you would realize that what you really did starts from is your result and your discussion. So how you address the aim and the specific objective is in the result. You see, so you spend less time in your background, you spend less time in your literature, and you just highlight your methodology. You don't have to talk in details about your methodology, because talking about what you did in your methodology can take the whole of the 10 minutes. So it's better to just list or itemize what you did in your methodology. Then after you have made your presentation, anyone that is not clear about your methodology can ask you specific questions on your methodology. Then you can use the panel's time to talk about your methodology. You see, because if you spend so much time, background, literature review, and the methods, and you don't have a lot of times to talk about what you said you are going to do and how you did it, then the whole purpose of the presentation is defeated. So you see why alignment is very, very important in your methodology. All right. And I said as a form of example here, if your objective is to identify factors associated with hypertension control, your method must show how blood pressure control and predictor variables will be measured and analyzed. That is the alignment we are talking about. So you can be working on a study where you're looking at factors associated with hypertension control, and in your population, you are interviewing adolescents. That is not alignment. You see, so you can be looking at age-related diseases like hypertension and diabetes, and you would not interview senior citizens. I remember a few years ago when some medical students were doing a study on the association between waist circumference and hypertension. And if you review literatures, I mean, you would see that there are a lot of studies that have shown that there is statistical significant association between waist circumference and hypertension. But interestingly, these students' study were not in line with those literatures that have been published, and the supervisor was really worried. I mean, did they do the analysis very well? So she asked them to come and meet me, and the part they brought was the part that concerns their main independent variable and outcome relating to hypertension. They didn't bring the analysis for the social demographic characteristics components, because that aspect is where she is truly having issues with. So I looked at the analysis, I looked at everything they have done. It is correct. But how come their result is far from what literatures are saying? So I asked them one question. What is your population? Who did you collect this data from? And they said, that they collected the data from their colleagues. So you see where the misalignment is. You're doing a study on hypertension and you're collecting data from your colleagues, same medical students that are probably between 17 to 18 years and maybe 27 years or maybe 30 years at most. So you most likely not find anything. So you see why alignment is very, very important. You have specific objective. It's not enough. There has to be an alignment with the methodology. In this case now, that objective has to be in alignment with the population that you're going to collect that data from. The second point here is choose the design intentionally. You don't choose a study design because it is easy. You choose it because it answers the research question. Like I often tell my students, it's not rocket science that anytime you are doing a study, and that study, it's a prevalence study, meaning you want to do a study on the prevalence of vaccine hesitancy, the prevalence of preeclampsia, the prevalence of diabetes mellitus, the prevalence of malaria, the prevalence of anything, any disease risk, you want to look at the prevalence. The moment the main aim for that study and the one of the specific objectives, usually the second one or maybe the first, is dealing with to determine the prevalence of something. By default, that study, it's a cross-sectional study. It's a descriptive cross-sectional study by default. You don't even need to crack your head. As long as it's a prevalence study, it's a cross-sectional study. So you don't decide, oh, I want to do an experimental study because you know that experimental study has a higher level of evidence, but your study aim does not fit into an experimental study design. So you choose. Yes, sorry about that. Okay. You choose your study design based on the aim or the specific objective that is guiding that study. The third one is plan for results before fieldwork. In other words, there's no harm doing some dummy tables, aligning your variables and what your analysis will look like before you go out to collect that data. All right. For example, you have a the same study, for example, where you are looking at hypertension control or diabetes care. There's no way you would look or talk about diabetes care. You will not have variables like glycemic control. All right. Glycemic control, it's one of the key variables when you're talking about diabetes care. We have the HbA1c. You can't talk about diabetes care without mentioning the HbA1c. So in other words, you have to ensure that the variables you're collecting also align with the aim and the specific objective you have drafted. So you see, all these things are very, very important and critical. So what is research really? From these definitions, which I really love so much, it says research is the systematic investigation into the study of materials and sources in order to establish fact and reach new conclusion. Now, why I highlighted that word, systematic investigation, is because the moment you have said, as a researcher, you want to do research, you have to appreciate the fact that a system is now involved, meaning that the entire process has to be carefully planned from inception to conclusion, guided under clearly defined objectives, controlled conditions that can be measured and evaluated, meaning that your research should be reproducible. That's what a sound methodology does for you. Somebody can read your work and they want to reproduce it in their setting. What helps reproducibility is sound research methodology. So as long as you said, I want to do research, you have to appreciate the fact that there is an entire planned process that you have to follow. For example, you do not say, oh, I am happy with using 200 persons for my research. I'm happy with using 150 persons for my research. I'm happy with using 300 persons for my research. There's nothing like that. You have to go through a systematic planned process they call sample size determination. You have to calculate scientifically the number of persons that you're going to recruit for that research. If you don't do that, you may run into issues of what we call type 1 and type 2 errors that we'll talk about as we progress. How you would select that number, even if you have calculated it scientifically, it's also a carefully planned process. Are you going to be doing a simple random sampling? Are you going to be doing a systematic sampling? Are you going to be doing a cluster sampling? You don't just decide, oh, I'm going to pick my sample anyhow I like. No. There is a carefully planned process. As long as you have said, I want to do research, you have to follow guidelines that had been set for that process. So that's the beauty of research. If you say you want to do research, then you have to follow the set down guidelines. And those set down guidelines are heavily found in your methodology, which is the key purpose for this workshop. So the scientific method starts with a problem. So once you have said you want to do a research, it means you want to solve a problem. There's no research you want to do today that does not solve a problem. Every research is done to solve a problem, whether it's a health research or it's a non-health research from different fields. So solving a problem is the motivation for scientific research. So once you have identified the problem in the environment, then you begin to state or formulate your hypothesis. And that hypothesis will include the study aim. It will include the specific objectives. It will include the research questions. Then it will include, in most cases, associations. Based on your literature review, once you have identified the problem you want to solve, you do some literature review. That literature review will be able to guide you what are the issues that are responsible for this problem. For example, if you want to look at respiratory tract infection amongst children, that is the problem you have identified in the environment. You state your aim to determine the prevalence of respiratory tract infection among children 0 to 5 years. And one of your specific objective may be to determine the prevalence if you're taking the data at one time, or to determine the incidence if you're taking the data over several years. And based on the literatures you have reviewed, you may be able to see some things that may be responsible for the respiratory tract infection. Things like carbon monoxide, probably the environment you are collecting this data from. Do they have high density of machines and automobiles that generate high concentration of carbon monoxide? Is it an area where they have gas flaring, soot flaring? So you may be able, based on the literature review, state a hypothesis. There is no significant difference or significant association between soot flaring or gas flaring and respiratory tract infection. So understanding the problem motivates you to state an aim, specific objective, research question, and also formulate hypothesis based on the things you have read and the things other people have said could be responsible for increasing the prevalence or the incidence of the respiratory tract infection. So once you sort out the hypothesis, you begin to design the experiments. So this is where your methodology come in heavily. You begin to look at the different methodological components, the study area, study population, study design, sampling, ethics, and many of them. So this is where you design the experiment. Then from the experiment you have designed, and based on your specific objective, it guides how you are going to design the data collection too. So you collect that data, you analyze that data, and you're able to draw conclusions. So this is how the scientific process goes. But you have to appreciate the fact that if you state a problem, you formulate a hypothesis, those are beautiful, but it doesn't end there. If the design of your experiment is faulted, you would not be able to collect data, you will not be able to analyze the data, you will not be able to draw conclusion, and you would not be able to disseminate your findings. That's why the research methodology understanding is very, very key. So where's the foundation here? It lies in aligning your research compass. You have to appreciate the fact that a strong methodology begins before the methodology chapter itself. Like I showed you, starts with a problem, starts with the hypothesis, starts with the research question, starts with the objective, because these things also flow into the methodology. The research question asks, what exactly are you trying to discover? That's your research question. What are you trying to discover? For example, what factors are associated with late antenatal booking among pregnant women? The objectives answer, what measurable goals must the study achieve? So in your objective, you'll be looking at to estimate, like I mentioned earlier, the prevalence, to also look at predictors, factors that are associated with your outcome. In this case now, late antenatal booking among the population, pregnant women. So the objective, what measurable goals must the study achieve? And the methodology, how will evidence be generated? So the methodology guides that process. Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to generate evidence and you want to be able to disseminate that evidence. But how do you go about generating the evidence truly? So that's where your methodology comes in. All right, so an example could be facility-based cross-sectional survey using systematic sampling and logistic regression. We will talk about these as we progress. So your study objectives, like I had mentioned, it has the two components. It has the aim, which is also called the general objective. That's the broad statement, the overall statement. Then when you have that overall statement, which sometimes called the aim and the objective, you can now break them down into specific objectives. All right? How you want to achieve them one by one. And two verbs are very important there. To, it's there. Then the different verbs that you are going to be using, determine, ascertain, establish, and the rest of them. So example here, using one of my studies, the overall aim of this study was to determine noise exposure levels and its health consequences among gospel instrumentalists in Pentecostal churches in Port Harcourt City, Nigeria. Now, you would notice the three verbs I have used in the specific objective area. The first one is to determine the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss among the population. The second one is to ascertain the behavior of gospel instrumentalists towards noise-induced hearing loss. The third one, to establish the predictors of. So you would see those verbs. So you can interchange the verbs. At some time you use determine, at sometimes you use ascertain, at sometimes you use establish. The one thing I want you to notice here is your objective and your research questions are the same, because I've seen a lot of times you will see students will map out research objective, and when you see the research question is totally different from the research, when they map out the specific objectives, when you see the research question, it's a totally different thing. I mean, that is not correct. Your research specific objective and your research question should align. So if your research objective is to determine the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss, all right, among gospel instrumentalists in selected Pentecostal churches in Port Harcourt City of Nigeria, your research question should be the same, but in a question form. What is the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss among the population? The second objective, to ascertain the behavior of gospel instrumentalists towards noise-induced hearing loss. What is the behavior of gospel instrumentalists towards noise-induced hearing loss? So your research question is the question form of your specific objective. They are not supposed to be two different entities. So I just thought I should mention that. All right, someone is asking, Gabriel, issuing of certificates. We have actually done trainings that require issue of certificate, but I don't know if this one, the one that we finished, I don't know how many of you attended the Association of Commonwealth University. Yes, that one warranted a certificate because we did it like for 5 days, so I'm not sure, but let's see how it goes. I will think about it and I'll come back to everyone. All right. Thank you. So in your methodology list, like I said, you have different aspects, and it usually starts with the study area. All right. Sometimes it is called your research setting, which is the place and context that make your sampling, measurement, and interpretation understandable. Where are you going to be collecting this data from? The specific location, that is your study area. The place where the study will be conducted, not the region. Because I know sometimes the study area, sometimes it can cause confusion with the study setting or the research setting. That's why some journals will say, please use study setting or research setting instead of study area, because oftentimes you will see someone may collect their data from a health facility, like the one in my area, the University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital. You're collecting your data at the antenatal clinic of the University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital. And when you're talking about the study area, you're focusing on the Port Harcourt city, because in assumption, the University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital is inside Port Harcourt. So your study area is Port Harcourt, but that is not correct. Because when we say in research study area, the focus is actually study setting, in the sense the exact location where you are collecting that data. So sometimes it can be a facility, like I'd mentioned, the University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital. Sometimes it can be an institution like the University of Port Harcourt, or it can be a community context. Maybe you want to collect data from Omagua community, or you want to collect data from Choba community, or Eneka community. So the study area is not Rivers State. If you're collecting the data from Eneka community, then the study area or your study setting is not Rivers State. It is that community. All right. So where you are collecting that data from. So in my own case now, if I say the study was conducted in Port Harcourt City, Nigeria, that is not correct, because I didn't conduct the study in Port Harcourt City itself. I conducted the study in selected Pentecostal churches in Port Harcourt City. And one of the criteria is that those churches would have instrumentalists that play musical instruments for at least 1 year. So if I say the study was conducted in Port Harcourt City, I am wrong, because that's not the setting where that study was conducted. Yes, I agree that the churches is in Port Harcourt City, but Port Harcourt City is not the study area, you see. So I am mentioning this because when a reviewer is looking at your work in terms of the study area, they are asking, why was the setting appropriate for the research problem? So if I say I am doing a study on noise-induced hearing loss, the reviewer's head is like, okay, noise-induced hearing loss. So you should be collecting your research setting will probably be where noise is generated, like the airport, construction sites, nightclubs, churches, or mosques. So if you say you're doing a study on noise-induced hearing loss, and you're collecting your data from maybe pupils in a secondary school, somewhere in a rural community, the reviewer would be cautious, because this is not an appropriate research setting for this kind of study. So you, as an individual, should ask yourself that question as well. Why am I selecting this setting? And why is this setting appropriate to answer the problem that I'm interested in? Let me give you another example. You're doing a study on preeclampsia, okay? And you now go to the University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital. Sorry, the University of Port Harcourt, because you feel that the University of Port Harcourt, they have female students. And those female students are also, most of them are women of reproductive age, meaning they should be between 15 years and 49 years. And you said, okay, that can be a good research setting, since I'm talking about preeclampsia. And preeclampsia also affects women in their reproductive age. But where you are missing is if the setting is appropriate for the research problem. The research problem is preeclampsia. Yes, I agree that preeclampsia can affect women of reproductive age, but preeclampsia means hypertension in pregnancy. So if those women are not, even if they are women of reproductive age, if they are not pregnant, then they are not the right setting for addressing that research problem. So you see why understanding your research setting is very important, because you have to ask yourself continuously, this setting that I want to carry out this study, will it be able to address my research problem? If I take students from a university, even if they are women of reproductive age, will they be able to answer the research problem I'm interested in, which is preeclampsia? The answer is no, because preeclampsia only affects pregnant women. So when you're writing the study area or the study setting for your work, you have to include only what helps the methodology. And what are the things that help the methodology? The exact setting and location where you're carrying out that research. Is it in a university? Is it in a health facility? Is it in a community? Is it even in a construction site, especially for those of us that are doing research on occupational health? Are you taking your participant from a construction company or from an oil rig or oil field? You have to mention the exact context. So in the study setting or the study area, you also have to state the population that that setting is serving and access to the participant, meaning do you have access to those participants and why this setting fits the research objective. So details you have to avoid, because oftentimes I've seen research methodology ARR, the component that has to do with your study area or your research setting. I've seen sometimes it's the student just keeps writing and writing and writing, because instead of focusing on the exact setting or location, they start talking about long geography and history of the area. Spend so many texts talking about history, about that geographical location, the latitude, the longitude, all those things are very important, but they should not be more than a paragraph. Don't use your entire, study area text and be focusing on geography and history of the area, irrelevant ecological or social demographic description. So for example, now, like in my own, my PhD, where I looked at strategies that will help vulnerable population use HIV self-testing kits, and I focused on brothels because it's a mixed study. I had the quantitative part where I used the demographic health survey, which is a secondary data, and I had the qualitative part where I did one-on-one interview with female sex workers, and somebody may wonder, so in a city like Port Harcourt, will you be able to get brothel-based female sex workers to interview? And from my research and based on data I found online, Port Harcourt City itself had hundreds of hotspots, of these brothels. So that detail was also in my methodology because I have to answer why this setting fits the research objective. So if you are in a setting where there's no hotspots for FSW, why would you be wanting to do a study where you're going to be interviewing them? So you see, these things are very important. Don't take them for granted. All right. So if I'm going to be naming Port Harcourt, the brothel sites, I mean, why are they suitable for helping me address my research objective? Because these are the sort of details a reviewer would want to see. So because oftentimes you also have to appreciate the fact that most of these reviewers are not in your setting. Imagine someone may be in the US reviewing the work you did in Port Harcourt. So you have to provide enough context for them to appreciate why you're choosing that setting and why that setting will help you address your research problem. So the next time you're writing your study area or research setting or study setting, please put all these parameters in mind. Yeah, Sam asks, is it necessary for every specific objective to have a corresponding research question? Yes, they have to align. If you have 5 specific objectives, you would have 5 research questions, because your research question is an output from your research objective. They have to be the same. The only difference is that one is a statement, the other one is a question. So we'll look at the study design, which is a very, very strong aspect that needs a lot of justification. All right. So anything you want to do, you have to have the mind of a designer for you to be able to get the output or the outcome that you want. You want to erect a house. I mean, you don't just buy blocks, buy sand, buy cement, and you just start building. I mean, that does not work. Before you start any project in terms of building, you will have to have a building plan, a building design. You have to have an idea what the building will look like when you finish, and the things you're going to do to get that building to the finish point. Even for those of us that want to run businesses, you will realize that for you to get a loan, for you to get some form of support, they will often ask you, where is your business plan? Where is your business design? You know why? Because if you don't have a business plan, if you don't have a business design, whoever intends to support you is not sure whether you're going to achieve any form of objectives for that business. That's the same way it works when it comes to research methodology. If you don't have a study design, an appropriate study design, your reviewers, your assessors, they fought the results. Because, like they say, when the foundations be destroyed, what shall the righteous do? In other words, if the foundation is not properly done, people become scared to even occupy that building. So design is very important. You can only know where someone is going to and where they are going to end up in terms of their businesses if they have a business plan. And you can only tell how solid a building is if it merits occupancy when you have a building plan, which also incorporates the foundational plan for that building. How you make the foundation for a bungalow is different from how you make the foundation for a one-story building. It's different from how you make the foundation for a 5-story building. And it's also different from how you make the foundation for a 10-story building. So every building structure has a different building design. Like every business has a different business plan. That's the same way every research has its own research design or study design process. So you have to appreciate the fact that for people to trust your research results, they have to trust your research design. I remember a few years ago, because I also do review. I'm privileged to be in some editorial boards and also privileged to review journals for, a lot of Q1 journals. And there's one particular paper I reviewed. The study design for that article was a cross-sectional study. And as you find out as we progress, when you're doing a cross-sectional study, it's a prevalent study, like I mentioned before, and you collect the data one time. You don't collect the data at different points in time. You collect data at different points in time for like a longitudinal study. But for a cross-sectional study, you collect the data at one time. But the researcher kept mentioning follow up, follow up, follow up, almost throughout the manuscript. Immediately, it tells me something that the research design for this work is faulty. You can only talk about a follow-up study or use the term follow-up for research designs like the randomized control trial, like experimental design, longitudinal study, even cohort study. You can talk about follow-up, because a cohort study, you have to follow the participant over time until they develop the outcome that you're interested in. I mean, you're doing a cross-sectional study and you kept mentioning follow-up, follow-up, and you can guess my recommendation for that manuscript. The study design is already faulty. It's already faulty. So I am not able to trust any result that is produced from that manuscript, because the manuscript has a faulty design. Just like I would not trust residing in a story building that has a faulty building plan or building design when it comes to the foundation. Imagine looking at the building plan and nothing was said about the foundation of that building. So do not take this for granted. Study design is very, very important. So Martin is asking, in the systematic arrangement, which one comes first, research question or research objective? It depends on your school. Different schools have their formats. Most schools will tell you, put your aim first, put your specific objective, then put your research questions, then put your research hypothesis. While other schools will tell you, put your research aim, put your research question, then put your research objective, then your hypothesis. So it depends on your school, so it's not really cast in stone, but whichever one you put first does not really matter. Well, for research hypotheses, it's slightly different from the research question itself. Your research question can be, what is the associated factors? That's a research question now. What is the associated factors of hypertension among senior citizens in the military? That is a research question. But when it comes to a research hypothesis, you will most likely not phrase it that way. You're allowed to use the umbrella word. What is the associated factors with regards to hypertension among senior citizens in the military, then you can mention the location in Nigeria or in Kenya or Malawi or Vienna. But when it comes to research hypotheses, you will have to use the specific factors. So meaning for your research hypothesis, the null hypothesis will now be there is no significant association between social demographic characteristics and hypertension among senior citizens. So you see the difference. In your research question, you can use an umbrella word, factors, predictors. But when you now come down to your research hypothesis, you have to distinguish that umbrella word, factors and predictors, and use individual independent variables. Like I mentioned, social demographic characteristics or socioeconomic factors you have to mention. Sometimes you can even go as far as breaking down the social demographic characteristics. Is age, is their educational level, or in the socioeconomic, is their income, you know. So that is how it works. Yes, of course. Most studies, Catherine, you will have everything together. Like I mentioned, you will have your study aim. You will have the study aim, which is the general objective. You will have your specific objective. You will have your research question, and you will now have the hypothesis below. So the four of them will often be in your work. So, Chisom, we've not started taking questions, but let me just do this for you so that we don't spend so much time here. You can now ask your question. Maybe it's a pressing question for you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, sir.
No worries.
I must am enjoying the session. Just, I wanted to ask a question on your slide before this one.
Okay.
There is a slide on specific objectives. Yes,
Yeah,
the
this
other
one.
one, the other one. So, how do you intend objective number two to ascertain the behavior of gospel instrumentalists? No, sir. The
Yeah,
one on instrumentalists. Okay, so how
yes,
do you plan to measure this? I've been wondering. Is
to
behavior
ascertain the
measurable?
behavior of gospel. Yes, you can measure behavior. Yes. So in terms of noise-induced hearing loss, the behaviors I mentioned is a very good example is how often do you use the headphone to play music?
Okay.
Yeah. So, and if you use the headphone to play music, can you guesstimate the volume? Is it at 30%, 50%,
Oh.
80%? Is it at max? You know, that is an example of a behavior.
I would have preferred maybe pattern or except if the objective is qualitative.
Well, if you say behavior, it's not a problem because when you ask people about their lifestyle, it's also their behavior.
Okay.
Unless you feel behavior may not be clear. Okay, so if behavior as a word is not very clear in
Hmm.
the objective, probably when they see the questions, they will understand what I mean by behavior.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. But I know why you are asking the question you're asking, because sometimes too, there's a thin line between something you can measure quantitatively and something that you have to measure qualitatively. So I know where you are actually coming from. Yes. So it is also good as a researcher to know when you have crossed quantitative to qualitative, because this one you won't be able to measure it quantitatively. So it's a very good question. So these are part of the issues that we are going to talk about as we progress. Okay, so this is where we were, where I was talking about how important your study design is. Now, when you're dealing with quantitative, you're dealing with numbers. That's why it's called quantitative. Anything quantitative has to do with numbers. So when you're talking about prevalence, you're talking about a number that has been converted to percentages. Prevalence proportion. You can test for association. When you're testing for association, you are basically testing for differences in numbers, differences in quantity, differences in means, differences in median, differences in percentages, estimating effect. In other words, estimating how far the numbers are from each other. So anything that has to do with measuring numbers, measuring quantity, measuring percentages, measuring means, measuring median, you're dealing with quantitative here. When you're talking about hypertension control, you're dealing with numbers. You are not able to measure hypertension if you are not talking about number, because hypertension is quantitative. There is a number for, blood pressure. Okay? There's a number for systolic, there's a number for diastolic. That's why you can measure hypertension quantitatively, because of the number, because of the quantity. But there are some things you are not able to measure quantitatively, like people's experiences. You may not be able to measure people's experience. I remember one study we did where we were looking at, we were exploring youth's experiences, during violence. Youth's experiences during violence. In those sort of things, you can't measure it quantitatively. So once you have a study aim that you are not able to measure quantity, you can't count number of times, then it automatically falls in the qualitative aspect. All right? Looking at experiences, looking at meaning of something, making people to define something, the meaning of something, for people to give you different perspective of their feeling or their experience about something. How they have been marginalized, how they've experienced barriers, and several decisions that have been made in their workplace that have influenced their work habits. These things, you may not be able to measure them using numbers. So you would have to interview them. Okay? You have to interview them. Now, if, for example, you are looking at a study where you want to measure postpartum women missing clinic visits, you can answer that quantitatively, but you may not be able to get much about their experience, their deep experience, why they truly miss clinic. If you're doing this as a quantitative study, you may be able to have questions like, have you ever missed a clinic visit? They will tell you yes or no. Why did you miss the clinic visits? Then you give them some options that you probably got from reviewing other people's literatures, and they will tick one. Anyone they see there and they tick, that's it. But you may not be able to get more information. Let me give you another example now. You know that if you're this, I think this example is fun because it taught me a lot of things during my adolescent years. Even till, and I used to volunteer for a youth organization, and we will make structured questionnaires and take it to the youths. And one particular time, we were trying to understudy the different abortive methods that adolescents are using. And we gave them options. And it will interest you to know that because we gave them options based on what we have reviewed in literature, nobody bothered to write anything. They would just tick the options, and that is it. Whichever options you give them, they will just tick it and move on. They don't bother telling you anything. But when we now moved it to a qualitative, where we now started asking them, it's interesting the things these young people will tell you. You will be shocked. You know, some started mentioning things like lime. I know some of us that are not Nigerians may not appreciate something they call akao. It's actually like a native, uh, a native. Uh, it has this feel of a stone. We use it for eating, making some type of food. You know, they tell you they use akao. Some even say they use small stout, big stout. I mean, you'll be hearing all kind, you'll be shocked the things they are telling you. And trust me, you would probably not be able to get those insights if you were doing just quantitative. So if your study is going beyond counting numbers, measuring quantity of something, then you may need to consider qualitative so that you can get deeper experiences of your participants. The mixed method is when you're combining both the quantitative and the qualitative, which is ideal most times. Like in my PhD, where I did strategies, that will promote or that will encourage the use of HIV self-testing. I use DHS data sets from 38 sub-Saharan African countries. I had a database of over 1 million, respondents in that database. But after cleaning up the data, I ended up with 24 sub-Saharan African countries using 500 and something thousand, which is still good. But to interest you to know that none of the information in that quantitative data could address strategies. There was nothing about strategies in the quantitative data. Irrespective of how robust it was, there's nothing. So I had to do qualitative interview for me to be able to get information on strategy. So certain times you have no choice, but you just have to do mixed method if you want to be able to satisfactorily address your study aim and some of your specific objective. So you do not choose a design, like I said before, because it is easy. You choose it because it answers the research question with the least bias and strongest feasible evidence. I knew, and I thank God for my supervisor, we knew that there was no way I would have satisfactorily answered the aim to determine strategies that will improve HIV self-testing with only quantitative data. There's no way, because I'm not sure someone is carrying a questionnaire and be asking people a strategy. These are things you collect qualitatively because they are people's experiences. So let's look at the quantitative method. Must every research, Grace is asking, must every research have hypothesis? Well, the only research that will have hypotheses, they are the research where you are associating independent variable and your dependent variable. If you have specific objective to determine the prevalence of these, to ascertain these, to explore these, any specific objective that is not looking at how an independent variable is associated with a dependent variable, then you would not need a research hypothesis. A research hypothesis only happens when you are associating two variables. Like the example I gave initially, you want to look at factors that are, associated with diabetes, or you want to look at factors that are associated with preeclampsia. The moment you want to look at factors, which is the independent variable, how they relate with or how they are associated with diabetes or diabetes control, which is the dependent variable, then you have a research hypothesis. What is the research hypothesis? The null would be there is no association between respondents, you mentioned the independent variable, and diabetes control. So research hypothesis only happens when there is an association between an independent variable and your research outcome, also called the dependent variable. Yes, of course, the word behavior would be captured in the operational definition of concept. Yes, it's there. It will definitely be there in your methodology, because part of what you do is to capture definitions of terms that you think may not be clear. Even the ones that are clear, you put them there. Yes, of course, it's there. Yes. When you say behavior, what do you really mean? What are you really measuring? What are you really capturing? When you say knowledge, what do you really mean? When you say poor knowledge, what does poor knowledge mean? What does good knowledge mean? What does adequate this mean? Yes, of course. So these are part of the terms that would be in your operational definition. Yes. Okay, someone said it's called as an account. Okay, yeah, someone said, NS said it's called potash or saltpeter. Okay, thank you for that. Someone is giving me a definition in Igbo. Akanwu is the local Nigerian Igbo name for edible potash. Okay, I hope you all saw this. Some people argue that mixed method should be where one has a survey questionnaire tool and do qualitative interview and not having questions that require the respondent to write. Please speak about that. Okay, I think I will come back to the question and answer. Let us move on. Maybe it will provide some clarification as we progress. So when you're dealing with quantitative method, like I said, first, quantitative method has to, I mean, you have to use numerical data. There's no way you're talking about quantitative, you will not use numerical data. You will have to use data that you have to be able to count number of something. Like whether they have preeclampsia or not, based on the test you have done, is a yes or no. At the end of the day, you'll be able to tell if you have 100 participants and 40 of them had no, 40 is too much. If you have 100 participants and 9 of them tested positive for preeclampsia, so 9 out of 100, that's 9%. So the prevalence for preeclampsia from that population is 9%. And that's a numerical data. That's an example of a numerical data. So if you're reviewing health records from the antenatal clinic, maybe from 2000 and maybe from 2015 to 2025, that is 10 years. Let's say you are reviewing health records from the University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital Antenatal Clinic from 2015 to 2025, that's 10 years. And in those records, you want to see all the women that visited the antenatal clinic between that 10 years, how many of them tested positive for preeclampsia? So that is also quantitative, but this time you can measure it as incidence. All right, so you can measure pattern, you can measure trend over time between 2015 to 2025. So you can see whether between these 10 years, if preeclampsia is increasing or reducing. Okay, so that is one of the conditions for quantitative. Whatever you are measuring, all right, you should be able to count it, and you should be able to tell the percentages or the proportion or the number of what you are measuring. Okay? And the statistical method, although we will talk about this in details during the statistical session, but the statistical method here for quantitative will most likely be your descriptive. You want to check the frequency, which is also called the counts, the number of times yes showed up for preeclampsia, the number of times malaria showed up for your study on the prevalence of malaria, or even if you're looking at intimate partner violence and you have defined intimate partner violence in your operational, guidelines or definition, like someone stated in the chart. And based on that operational definition, you're able to quantify if the lady had experienced intimate partner violence or not. You will be able to count the number of times, which is the frequency, and give a percentage for it. All right. So some of the descriptive statistics you can, so the frequency and the percentage will only apply for categorical variables, like yes or no responses, other categorical variables like educational level is a categorical variable where the values are like no formal education, primary, secondary, tertiary. That is categorically. Even wealth index is categorical in terms of low income, high income, moderate income. They are categorical. You can count the number of times each value is applying. But when you're dealing with numbers, continuous variable, you will not be able to do frequency for continuous variable. Continuous variable, I mean, is like age. When we are talking about continuous variable, we are actually talking about variables that have decimals. All right, like weight that have decimals, BMI have decimals, height have decimals. So when you say continuous, it means that variable or those numbers have decimals. When you're talking about discrete, they are numeric, they are numbers, but they don't have decimals. Like when you say number of children, they are numbers, but they don't have decimal. You can't say I have 1.5 child or 1.5 children. There's nothing like that. You only have one child or two children or three children. But sometimes we treat age, like I'd mentioned several times in our classes. Sometimes we treat age as if age is a discrete variable. When you ask someone, how old are you? The person will tell you, I'm 20 years old, or I'm 25 years old, or I'm 26 years old. All right. But you can only be 25 years old if that day is your birthday. So if that day is not your birthday, you are 25 years and 1 day, or 25 years and 6 days, or 25 years and 9 months. So there would be decimals in your age. That's why when you're designing a questionnaire for age, it's good to write it age at last birthday, so that they will give you a whole number age at their last birthday. Because if you're collecting their age on that day, then it will not be whole number. It will not be whole number. So for continuous variable, you collect mean. You collect mean. For discrete variable, especially for those of them that are structured, like when you're dealing with Likert scale, which is discrete, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can't do mean for that. It's better to do median for that, because even if you are writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that one does not mean number one. One means probably strongly disagree. 2 means disagree. 3 means undecided. 4 mean agree. 5 mean strongly agree. So the fact that you're writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doesn't mean they're actually numbers. Each of those numbers means something. So if you say a mean of 1.5, what does 1.5 mean? Does that mean half of strongly disagree and half of disagree? So that's why it's easier to do a median, so that it still gives you a whole number, so that you can be able to accurately quantify that whole number to somewhere. Whole number 2, you know, is disagree. Whole number 3, you know, is undecided. Whole number 4, you know, is agree. Whole number 5, you know, is strongly agree, you know. And oftentimes, if you are dealing with continuous variable, you also do not just say you're going to do mean or you're going to do median. You also have to run the normality test, which we'll talk about much later. The normality test, the popular one is the Shapiro-Wilk. So you have to run normality test for that continuous variable. So if you run the normality test for that continuous variable and your p-value is less than or equal to 0.05, meaning statistically significant, then you can say that that continuous variable statistically deviates from normality. So if that continuous variable statistically deviates from normality, then you are not allowed to use mean, which goes with standard deviation. So if that continuous variable is skewed, the appropriate descriptive statistics will now be median and interquartile range, which is the 25th and 75th percentile. But if that continuous variable is normally distributed based on the p-value being not being significant, then you can now use mean and standard deviation. The inferential statistics differ. You can use chi-square, which measures differences in percentages. You can use the student t-test, which measures differences in 2 means. You can use the ANOVA, which measures differences in 3 or more means. You can use the regression, especially if you want to use the logistic regression that can tell you the quantification of the particular value in the independent variable having that outcome. So for example, now, if you have an independent variable like exposure to headphone, let's say that is the independent variable, exposure to headphone usage, yes or no, then the dependent variable is noise induced hearing loss present, yes or no. So apart from the fact that you have used chi-square to check for the differences in percentages, you can use the logistic regression to check how many times those that said they used headphone regularly were susceptible to noise-induced hearing loss. So the logistic regression gives you a value like numbers, 1 point something, 2 point something. So if you have a logistic regression, which is the odds ratio, but that odds ratio will depend if your study design is cross-sectional or case control, because if you're doing a cohort, then you are now dealing with relative risk. We'll talk about that more later as we progress. So if your odds ratio is 2.3, then you are telling us that those that said they use headphones regularly are 2.3 times more likely or more at odds of developing noise-induced hearing loss. So you see, all these statistical processes are quantitative because they are either dealing with checking for differences in percentage, or they are dealing with checking for differences in numbers, mean numbers or median differences, you see. And quantitative in terms of relationship, you can use it for, like someone has said, hypothesis. You see, exploring relationship. Like the example here now, does sleep duration affect productivity? So if I'm to phrase this as a research objective, it would be to determine the relationship between sleep duration and productivity. To determine the relationship between sleep duration and productivity. That's the research objective. The research question will be, is there a relationship between sleep duration and productivity? Is there a relationship between sleep duration and productivity? That's the research question. The hypothesis, the null hypothesis will now be, there is no significant association between sleep duration and productivity. then the alternate hypothesis will now be there's a significant, association between sleep duration and productivity. So you can use significant, you can just say, for your hypothesis, you can say there is no relationship, there is no difference, or there is no significant difference. So any of those terms you use is fine. So that is how your specific objective differs from your research question, differs from your hypothesis. So there will be no hypothesis if you're not measuring an independent variable, example, sleep duration, against a dependent variable, in this case now, productivity. Why is it a dependent variable? Because that is the primary reason why you're doing this study. You want to assess productivity. So key research methods here, which we'll talk more in details as we progress. To collect your data, you normally use survey process, using different, you can use questionnaire, you can use Kobo Connect, you can use Qualtrics, you can use SurveyMonkey, you can use Google Form, different online forms. So the data collection is usually done using survey method. If it's experimental study you're doing, you probably will still use survey method, or you can use a questionnaire as well. Because in an experimental method, you will have the control group, then you will have the intervention group. Or you can use secondary data, like in my own case, where I use the demographic health survey. It still applies because the demographic health survey or the census data, they measure numerical data in terms of quantitative data, because they have categorical variables and they also have numerical variables. So for the quantitative method, you can do your own primary data collection, meaning you design your own questionnaire, but you have to appreciate the fact that if you're designing your own questionnaire, it has to also go through the different validity processes. You remember in our last class, we were talking about validity and reliability. And that is very, 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 very important. So so just a second, I need to get those for those of you that were not in that class. You don't just design a questionnaire. You don't just design a questionnaire like that without having to put it through the process of validating it and the reliability of it. So I'm going to share the recording that we did last week. So let me share that now. So this is the one for day one that talks about validity. In case you were not there, I'm sharing the recording, how to validate your tool. Then the second recording I'm sharing is the day two, where we talked about reliability using Chromebus Alpha, K20, test retest, and the rest of them. So that is it. So the next thing I will be sharing quickly, it's because in a few days time, I will be uploading some recordings I have done, but like I said, I didn't do webinars for them. So I'm going to be uploading them on the YouTube. So please do well to subscribe so that you would see the recording as they come. And the final link I'm going to share is we have a community, the Rising Scholar Data Science Hub. So you can join so that when updates are posted, you can easily see it. All right, you can join the family. All right, thank you very much. I think we would progress now. Okay, so please remember to watch those videos because you don't just use tools like that. You design questionnaire, you design Google Form, you design SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, all these online forms methods. There are so many of them these days, and I have not used all of them, but I've used most of them, so it's not enough to create your tool. That tool has to be validated. It has to go through some rigorous testing. That's the point I'm making. So it's very important that you master validity. It's very important that you master reliability because these are the things that they will always ask. When you publish your work, reviewers will always ask this question if they don't see it clearly in your methodology. If you claim you didn't use a validated tool, how was your tool validated? Because if that tool is not validated, then we don't trust the result that is coming out from that tool. So these are very, very straightforward things that we shouldn't play with. When it comes to having accurate methodology that can be reproducible. So as long as you're using primary data collect, meaning primary means you are the one creating the data collection tool. It has to go through validity and reliability. All right. So please watch those videos so that you can grab more the experience. Now, if you're using secondary data like the demographic health survey data that I used, or you are using the DHIS2, which is another platform in the health management information system. So if you're using it, then you may not need validity and reliability because especially DHS data, which I know very well, they already go through the process of validity and reliability before they administer this questionnaire to collect this data. So they have already done the validity and all that for you. So you may not need to do that if you're using secondary data. But in my own case now, where I now added a new tool, which is the in-depth interview guide that I added to my work because of the qualitative aspect. That one is not a secondary data. That one is a primary data. So it may not go through reliability because reliability is testing for consistency in terms of the questions you are asking, their ability to address your main research construct. So since qualitative interview guide are not designed like that, it can only do validity, but you may not need reliability. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this particular session talking about validity and reliability, but for me to be bringing it up, it's because it's a very if I begin to do interview for researchers, do a short survey and share amongst early career researchers, you will see that a very good number of them, their research papers were rejected because they could not prove appropriate testing process. They could not prove appropriate testing process for their tool. So please don't take it for granted. Please, it's a very important skill to have. So now we go to exposure and outcome, which is a very important aspect. But before we go to exposure and outcome, let me look in the chat for some questions. Then we would progress to this Okay. Catherine asks, some people argue that mixed method should be where one has a survey questionnaire to and do qualitative interview and not having questions that require the respondent to write. Well, I understand what you're asking, Catherine. When you design a questionnaire, that questionnaire will have what they call close-ended and open-ended question. The close-ended questions are questions that the participant have no choice but to choose an option. So if you ask a participant, what is your educational level? You have already listed the possible educational level that may be. No formal education, primary, secondary, tertiary, postgraduate. So they will most likely tick one. Although interestingly, if you're doing a research, like the research, there's a study we did in 3 countries. We did in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, Florida, USA, Ottawa, Canada. It will interest you to know that this no formal education, primary, secondary, tertiary, postgraduate, works most of the time in Africa because we're too much into book and reading book and schooling. In Canada, our survey showed that majority of them, in Canada and the US, our survey showed that majority of them went to vocational schools. So all this your PhD and all this your this thing, we like book too much in Africa. So if you're designing that same tool in US and Canada, you may not use that format of primary. You will have to put vocational school, you have to put technical college and all that because they have all those things a lot there. They are not heavy. It is we that go there to do all the heavy program, master's, PhD. But for them, they also take advantage of real skill development trainings, you see. So if you design a questionnaire that is that close-ended, yes, of course, it is survey questionnaire. But there are some times in that survey questionnaire, you add some open-ended question. Like, for example, now, you can ask, if you had asked them, what is your educational level? And you listed no formal education, primary, secondary, tertiary, postgraduate. You can follow up with an open-ended question. If none of this, you see, this is an open-ended question. If none of this apply to you, could you please state any form of education that you have? And they may write, oh, I went to technical college. Oh, I went to vocational school. Oh, I just went to catering school. So the fact that they are filling an open-ended question for you in your survey questionnaire does not mean that is a qualitative interview. That's not a qualitative interview. That's a survey questionnaire that has open-ended questions in them. You know why I say that's not a qualitative interview? Because you may not be able to do thematic analysis with those informations. For you to be able to generate thematic analysis, themes, it means you have to do real qualitative interview. Either you're doing in-depth interview or you're doing focus group discussion. Okay, so I hope I answered your question. Someone said in Ghana it's called Kanwu. Okay, interesting. Sounds almost alike Kanwu in Ghana. Okay, that's by Clement. What is the difference between study design and study approach? Well, the only difference I may say is in the language. There's nothing like study approach scientifically. There's nothing like study approach scientifically. But scientifically, we have study design, which we will see the different study design because the different study design in epidemiology, public health, biostatistics, they are tied to exposure and outcome, which is why I wanted to take some questions before I move to exposure and outcome, because all these cross-sectional case control, cohort, experimental you are hearing, they are tied to exposure and outcome. So when you say study design, we all know what you're talking about. Either it's a cross-sectional, either it's a case. But when you say study approach, it can mean anything. It can mean, oh, you want to tell us how you collected your data. That's the study approach. Oh, you want to tell us how you were able to go into the community and meet the stakeholders that are involved. Oh, that's the study approach. So study approach can be anything. It can be what you did. in the study process to collect your data. So but when you say study design, is very fixed. Like when you say study design, we are aware of what you mean. Must every descriptive statistics be followed with inferential statistics? Not exactly. It depends. It depends, because if you do a study that has only descriptive statistics, you may not likely have solved the problem. That is the thing. So imagine now you want to do a study on the noise-induced hearing loss, for example, and you tell us, oh, for descriptive statistics, we had more males. Of course, we will know we have more males because more males will most likely be playing musical instruments. Oh, we have more people that have tertiary education. We have more people that have been playing for 10 years and more. Those are descriptive. Oh, we have prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss of 25%. Okay, that's good. But you have not solved any problem using descriptive statistics, because you have not told us the 25% that had noise-induced hearing loss, what made them susceptible to that noise-induced hearing loss. Is it their age? Is it their exposure? Is it their behavior? You have not told us. So it's only inferential statistics where the independent variable is associated with the outcome, in this case, noise-induced hearing loss. That's when we'll be able to know if these independent variables are the one making them more susceptible to noise-induced hearing loss. Now you're solving a problem. You see why? So that's why most journals may not likely, they will, but most journals, when you send a paper that is filled with descriptive statistics, they will write you back like, what problem have you solved? I mean, this is just descriptive statistics. You are telling us, oh, there's a problem here, there's a problem here, there's a problem here, but you are not telling us what is responsible for the problem. That's the inferential statistics. What is making the problem big or small? That's inferential statistics. So you see why, like in my school of public health, I mean, where I tutor the University of Port Harcourt School of Public Health, even the PUTO, you know, the one for the public health research for toxicology and environmental sciences. If you do a study and you have only descriptive statistics, you will likely not be able to graduate. They tell students that you must have at least one inferential statistics in your dissertation. At least one inferential statistics. Why? Because it is the inferential statistics that solves a problem, not the descriptive statistics. The descriptive statistics just tells you that there's a problem, but it doesn't tell you what is causing the problem and how you can help solve that problem. Someone asks, what is the difference between definition of concept and conceptual clarification? Well, I don't really know very much, but I know that definition of concepts are the key variables you will be measuring in your, like if a key variable for my work and noise-induced hearing loss behavior, I measured the tinnitus, I measured noise-induced hearing loss, I measured sound pressure level. All these things, I have to define them. But when you're talking about conceptual clarification, I don't know if you are talking about the theory, because when we are dealing with conceptual, we're dealing with theory, so I don't know if it's the conceptual clarification. Maybe later on during the question and answer, you can speak up and clarify me more, because every study has the theoretical framework and the conceptual framework. The conceptual is the one you conceived as the researcher. The theory is the one that is out there. You go and look for it to support your work. Like in my own work now, which is the noise-induced hearing loss, one of my theoretical framework is health belief model. because a lot of the noise-induced hearing loss is associated with belief, you see. So, but the conceptual framework is the one based on the fact that you're not able to find a theory, you now conceptualize, your own. Okay, Ismail, we will have to talk about this later. Someone is asking Luncy, which is what I was saying, I just said now. How do you go about novelty in your research work? When reviewers ask what is new about your study. So in other words, what is new about your study? Please, listen. When reviewers ask what is new about your study, it may not necessarily mean your work is novel per se, like novelty in terms of the fact that nobody has done any work like that before. It may be that what pressing problem is this research solving? Why should we be interested in this research? So your ability to prove that your research is solving a pressing problem, a pressing need in your local community is novel enough. For you to prove that your study is solving a pressing need in your local community is novel enough. Most times when they ask you novelty, what is new? It's not the fact that people have not talked about it. It's the fact that in the community where you did this work is novel, because nobody has done that kind of work before. Probably those kind of findings have not been seen in your own local setting. So you have to promote that. They're not asking for something that nobody has done before. Of course, it may be challenging to do a research that you are the only one that have done it. Because if you're the only one that have done the research, how would you get literatures for your literature review? How would you even be able to compare your work and also check and compare and contrast your work with other people's findings in your discussion section? You see, so you should also bear this in mind, when it comes to the novelty. Information about budget for my study. You can actually Google that. If you Google that, I think you'll be able to get something. However, if you send me a WhatsApp message, I can share with you some formats I have. You can share with me a WhatsApp message later. I can share with you some formats I have on budget. Can I open-ended question in a survey and use it for qualitative analysis? Someone is asking if you use open-ended question in a survey and use it for qualitative analysis. Well, I would not recommend that as a true qualitative analysis. However, for open-ended questions, you can analyze them and get quantitative, because if you're asking open-ended question in a survey questionnaire, the best they can give you is numbers of how many times something appeared. That's the best it can give you. How many times someone said they went to vocational school that didn't tick any of the options you gave. How many times? So all the questions that they wrote, you can still get numbers. You can put them in groups and still get quantitative numbers. So it's not qualitative at all. When you say qualitative, you're talking about themes. You are not dealing with numbers in terms of how many times. No, you are dealing with this person said, you think, like, for example, now in my own qualitative work, I saw that most of them said that if the price of the HIV self-test kit is low, and they gave a range in terms of budget, if it's lower than, I think some of them said if it's lower than $2, they will be able to afford it. So part of the theme for my qualitative is cost, because a lot of them kept talking about costing, we will be able to afford it and all that. So part of the team for my qualitative analysis was cost. And I now put in bits the quotes most of them said about cost. But I will not be able to say so number of people mentioned cost, so number of people mentioned cost. No. Qualitative deals with teams. One of the team is costing. That's a team. You will now mention the different people that said something about, but you won't be able to say so number of people said if the test kit is, the price is reduced, they will be able to purchase it. So I'm not sure just putting open-ended question in your survey qualifies for qualitative analysis. No. Qualitative analysis, you have to design either an in-depth interview or a focus group discussion, take it out there, interview them, record it, transcribe the recording, put it into qualitative data analysis platform like InVivo to help you generate themes. Because here you are not dealing with quantity or number of times a particular word appear, which is what will happen if you have it in open-ended in your survey. So there's no need. If you want to do qualitative, please go ahead and do through qualitative research. Okay. All right. I think I've been able to answer the question in the chat box. So let's look at exposure and outcome. Exposure and outcome. Now, in the field where I am, in the field of public health, epidemiology, biostatistics, everything is all about exposure and outcome. I know for some of us, it may not be the same for your field, and I'm really sorry about that, okay? But in my field, everything is about exposure and outcome. Every research we do in my field is about exposure and outcome. What were they exposed to? What was the outcome? Children are exposed to soot. Children are exposed to gas flaring. I remember many years ago in my city, Port Harcourt, we had a lot of issues with soot. You wake up in the morning, everywhere is black. If you put your clothes out, they are black. Your car is black. Because we had some issues with, soot. They were burning some refined crudes, and it was generating a lot of soot in the air. I remember that time, I think I just had my son, and I was mopping my sitting room everywhere in the room. I was mopping. We used to mop like 3 or 4 times in a day. Because when you have kids, you have to, because they have to crawl, they have to touch things. It was crazy. And we also noticed a surge in respiratory tract infection among children in our University of Port Harcourt Teaching Hospital during that time. So what was the exposure? Soot in the environment. What was the outcome? High prevalence of respiratory tract infection. That was the outcome. I have some examples here that I got from this book. The citation is here in case you want to go and review it. It's a book that is published in the United States that is looking at the impact of climate change on human health. And it showed exposure and health outcome, which is really fantastic. In the first one, which is extreme heat, what was the exposure? Elevated temperatures. What was the health outcome? Heat-related death and illness. For outdoor air quality, what was the exposure? Worsened air quality, ozone, particulate matter, and higher pollen counts. What was the health outcome? Premature death, acute and chronic cardiovascular and respiratory illness. For flooding, what was the exposure? Contaminated water, debris, and disruptions to essential infrastructure. What was the health outcome? Drowning, injuries, mental health consequences, gastrointestinal, and other illness. Vector-borne infection. What was the exposure? Earlier and geographically expanded tick activity. What was the health outcome? Lyme disease. So in our field, in health sciences, for every research you do, if you're a health person here in this platform now, or you are a public health student, epidemiology student, you're generally doing a work around health. Even if you're a social science student, you're a business student, or you're an engineering student here, or whatever field you're doing, if you incorporate the health component into what you're doing, because of the interdisciplinary nature of research these days, there is always this intermix between different disciplines. So if you're bringing in health in the research you do, look at that research very well. You will see that the exposure and the outcome component is inside of it. It's inside of it. All right. And the exposure and the outcome is primarily what determines your study design, your quantitative research design. I know a lot of persons had not thought about this, but I noticed that if I teach it this way, it's easy for students not to cram study designs, because a lot of times we cram study designs. That's why when we conceptualize a research, we are not sure what study designs it is, because we are cramming the designs. If you're able to look at the design from the lens of exposure and outcome, you will likely not have to cram what your next study design would be after this session. So for epidemiological study design, this is the format. First, you have the non-experimental, which is the observational studies. Then you have the experimental, which is the interventional studies. All right. You don't need to worry. We would look at these things individually as we progress. So for the observational studies, why are they called observation? Because you are not providing any form of intervention. That's why it's called non-experimental. The moment you say you're doing an experimental study, it means you will be providing one form of intervention or not. Either you are providing an intervention in terms of drug, or you're providing an intervention in terms of knowledge. Do you know that you can actually do a study where you make a group of children to watch television 24 hours, and you make another group of children to be reading books, and at the end of the day, maybe at the end of 3 months, you give both of them basic exams, and you want to find out who will do better? Is it the ones that spend all their day watching television, or the ones that spend, majority of their day reading books, solving problems, and all that? Of course, ethics is not going to approve that kind of study, because I'm just using it as an example. But that is the kind of study that we call experimental, because there is a form of intervention there. What is the form of intervention? You're either making them watch TV or not to watch TV, or you are either making them read or not to read. You are doing something. You are providing something. In terms of the non-experimental, which is the observational studies, you are not doing anything. You are only observing. Anything that has been done is done in the environment. You had no influence with it. That's the difference. You are just observing what you are just observing the influence, the default influence the environment had put in that atmosphere. You remember the example I told you about the suit, the generation of soot in the atmosphere, and students and children were coming down with respiratory tract infection. Was the researcher responsible for the suit? No. The researcher didn't go and ask people to generate suits because you want to know whether children will have respiratory tract infection. Of course, there's no ethics that will approve that kind of study. So the suit is in the environment. So that's why it's observational. You are just observing what is happening. You are just observing the respiratory tract infection prevalence or incidence. You had no hand in the suit. So that's what the observational study group is all about. Everything you do, you just observe. Whatever the outcome is, you just observe. You have no hand in it. But in the experimental, you do. You must have a hand in it one way or the other. So that's the difference. So in the observational studies, you can either have the population base or the individual base. And in the population base, it's divided into descriptive, example health survey, analytic, example ecological study. In the individual base, is divided into descriptive, for example, case report, case series, or analytic, which is divided into the three aspects we will be focusing on. The cross-sectional, also called prevalence study, like I told you before. If you're doing any study and you're going to be checking prevalence of something, by default, it's a cross-sectional study design. You don't even need to break your head about it. The other analytical is the case control study or the case reference. Then you have the cohort study or the follow-up. For the experimental, you have two major categories: the randomized control trial, which is the original experimental design. Then you have the non-randomized, sometimes called quasi-experimental, which is quasi means false, not a true experimental like the randomized control trial. So let's look at these things in details with examples. All right. So for the observational, which is the non-experimental, for the descriptive health survey, imagine you are surveying, all right, the estimation of the prevalence of hypertension among adults in Port Harcourt. And where are you doing that? In a health care facility. So you go to a healthcare facility and you check the blood pressure of the participants that are there. That's a descriptive health survey. Why is it descriptive? Because you just want to know whether they have a health condition, the health condition you're interested in or not. Do they have hypertension? Yes or no? Do they have diabetes? Yes or no? Do they have these? Yes or no? Do they have malaria? Yes or no? So you are just describing the health condition they have. So that's why it's a descriptive health survey. You are not trying to know what caused the hypertension. You just want to know whether they have hypertension or not. So it's a prevalence study, and it's observational because there's no intervention. You were not responsible for giving them the food or manipulating their lifestyle to make them come down with hypertension. You have no role in that. So it's observational. It's non-experimental. So ecological is dealing with regions, not individual. Ecological deals with region. When you say you're doing ecological study, you're not dealing with human beings. You're dealing with regions like local governments, countries, counties, districts. That's what ecological study is all about. So a good example may be comparing malaria rates across local government areas and relating them to rainfall or drainage conditions. You can do this study comfortably in states in Nigeria, like in Rivers State where I live. We have lots of rainfall. Even as I'm having this session right now, it's raining. I know those that are joining me maybe from Abuja, it may not be raining right now, or if there's someone here joining me from Kanu, or maybe in the north, where you have more, dry environment, it may not be raining there right now, but it's raining here right now because it's always raining here. That was one of the shocking experience of my wife because she moved from Abuja, which is the central, and it's dry. I know they experience rainfall, but it's drier. So when she moved over to Rivers State, I mean, they will say culture shock. The first experience was it's always raining here. It always rains here. So and we have this uh knowledge that where it rains a lot, you may have more stagnant water, which is breeding places for mosquitoes. Maybe that may cause more malaria. So someone may be interested and say, okay, I may want to compare malaria rates in Kaduna and Port Harcourt, or in Kaduna and River State. So they may pick selected local government areas in Kaduna pick selected local government areas in River State and compare the malaria rates to see whether the excessive rainfall may be responsible. So that is an ecological study because you are comparing localities, region, not human beings, not individual people. So a case report would be a condition as a medical doctor. So mostly medical doctors that publish case reports based on your experience of practice. Maybe you are an expert, in any form of condition, but you probably came across a case that is very new and unique to you. You may want to publish a case report on that, focusing on that particular issue. So when you say case report, not case reports, case report, meaning that for every report that is published is only one case that is there. That's why it's called case reports, not case reports. So you may be reporting one unusual case of severe, did you see that? One unusual case of severe mpox infection in an immunocompromised patient. So case report, you report one case only and you publish it. And that case you're reporting something unique. There's something unique about that case. That's why you want to publish it for others to read. But case series is different. Case series, you are dealing with more than one case. So imagine describing 15 patients admitted with cholera during an outbreak. So that's a case series. So you can monitor the cases from when case 1 came in, case 2, case 3, up to case 15. How they were admitted, what they were exposed to, what are the medications they took before they came, how were their recovery process, what symptoms did they show up, It's a case series. So you may describe the different characteristics of 15 patients in terms of cholera outbreak in a community. So that's a case series. Now, when you're talking about cross-sectional study, it's a prevalence study, like I mentioned. You are assessing the prevalence of something, vaccine hesitancy, COVID-19. So prevalence is like percentages, like I mentioned before. You take a cross-section of a particular people that are susceptible to a condition you are interested in. Pregnant women are susceptible to preeclampsia. Women of reproductive age are not. So we can't take a cross-section of women of reproductive age to measure preeclampsia because they are not susceptible to preeclampsia. For you to be susceptible to preeclampsia, you have to be pregnant first. So you take a cross-section of women that are pregnant and you want to know how many of them were diagnosed of preeclampsia. So if there are 100 of them and 12 of them were diagnosed with preeclampsia, you calculate the prevalence. How? 12 times 100% divided by 100. That will give you 12%. So cross-sectional studies are usually prevalence studies, and you collect those data at one point in time. A case control study is usually a study where you focus on the case you are interested in. In a cross-sectional study, you don't focus on those that already have the condition. You just take a cross-section. And in taking a cross-section, you're able to measure and test and get out those that have the condition. But in a case control, you go for those that already have. That's why it's called case. You go for the cases. So if you're interested in doing a study for tuberculosis, then you have to go and get a record of those that already have tuberculosis. So you most likely be using medical records. So you get all the folders of those that already have tuberculosis. You begin to review what made them susceptible to tuberculosis, but you also need a control. So you also take people that don't have tuberculosis, all right, but the same characteristics with the people that have tuberculosis, probably the same adults or the same children, all right? For cohort study, they don't have the condition you are interested in. You expose them to that condition and you follow them over time and see whether they will develop the outcome. All right. For example, those that are you have a group of people that are smokers, you have a group of people that are non-smokers, and you follow them up over 10 years. All right. So for cohort study, you have to appreciate the fact that the exposure there, you would be responsible for that exposure. So if you're doing a cohort study with this example now I've given you, it means you will encourage one group to smoke and you will encourage another group not to smoke. And you follow them over time and see whether the group that smoked will develop lung cancer compared to the group that did not smoke. All right. But if you don't want to be the one, which is like prospective cohort study, you don't want to be the one exposing them, you can do a retrospective cohort study. What is a retrospective cohort study? You notice the exposure is already in the environment. You start following them up. For example, in the example I gave, as a researcher, you notice that there's this soot that is in the environment in a particular city. And as a researcher, you know that when you have excessive soot like this, it will definitely lead to respiratory tract infection. So what do? You start following up children. You start following up children in the region where there's soot. And you can follow up children in the region where there's no soot. So in the region where there's soot, you are following them up. You are not responsible for the exposure. The exposure is already there, but you are retrospectively, because you didn't start the exposure. The exposure has been there before you came. That's why it's retrospective. You're just following the children up to see those that will develop respiratory tract infection as time goes. And how will you know those that are admitted to the teaching hospital? But you go to another community, maybe outside the state where there's no suit, and you also follow up the children and be in the teaching hospital to see how many of them come down with respiratory tract infection. That way you will be able to tell whether those that are in the suit region are more at risk of developing respiratory tract infection than those that are not in the suit region. So these are observational. Okay? These are observational. Now, for experimental, you definitely have a case. What I mean, like the intervention group, then you have the control group. You have the intervention group, you have the control group for a randomized control trial. So let's say, for example, randomly assigning patients with hypertension to receive a new drug or standard treatment, then comparing blood pressure. So you have a new drug that has been released, and you're told that this drug will reduce hypertension, will help patients with hypertension by reducing blood pressure. So you can carry out a randomized control trial by randomizing participants that already have hypertension. So you randomize them, and some of them, you put them in the group that will receive the new drug. You now put some in the group that will continue to receive the standard treatments, those that are taking normal hypertensive medications. Then you follow them over time. After 6 months, 1 year, you check the BP level of those taking the new medication and the BP level of those taking the standard treatment. That way you will be able to tell whether the new medication is effective or not. Quasi-experimental, the difference is that it is quasi, it's not a true experimental. So you don't randomize and you don't really use drug. You can use things like training people how to do a particular thing. Hand washing, for example, hand washing, for example, campaign, sensitizing a community how to wash their hands. Then in another community, you're not sensitizing them how to wash their hands. Then at the end of the day, you check the community that you sensitize on hand washing that are washing their hands, and the ones you didn't sensitize that are still washing their hands, but not as much as those that you sensitize. How is the diarrhea rate like? which group has more diarrhea rate before the sensitization and after the sensitization. All right. So sometimes you can do a community trial. So you can provide insecticide treated bed nets to one community, and another community, you don't provide anything. They let them continue to use what they are using. And you come back after 6 months to measure the prevalence of or the incidence of malaria, since it's over time, not prevalence now. Okay, so talking about this in details, we would move over these, though I had spoken about them in bits, so we will talk about them in details in the session tomorrow. So it's already past 3, so we've exhausted our time. So thank you very much for attending this session. So we will continue tomorrow.